I've been working on this series of videos around the concept of ego death, and I wanted to make sure I had as much information and different perspectives as possible, because I think the phrases ego and ego death are thrown around very loosely in psychedelic discussions. What actually is the ego, and what does it mean to kill it? Is it even a good idea to try and kill your ego? To answer this, I looked to someone who is an expert on the field of study that encapsulates these phrases, which is analytical psychology, created by Carl Jung right here in Switzerland. Now, unfortunately, Jung himself wasn't available to talk to me, seeing as he died back in the 1960s. But luckily for me, I have the next best thing in my friend Mackenzie Amara, who is a psychoanalyst in training at the International School of Analytical Psychology in Zurich. Like me, she's also very interested in psychedelics, and she runs psychedelic integration workshops, which is how I met her. She also writes blog posts and publishes thoughts and video essays via her Instagram account, which is called The Inked Shrink. Link in the description below. So yeah, she knows her shit, and we had a few days of some really nice weather, so I thought let's get out on the balcony, we'll drink a few cold beers, and we'll see if we can untangle what we actually mean when we talk about the ego. As well as doing that kind of psychoanalytical deep dive, we also talked about psychedelics, social media, and a few other tangents. Now, Mackenzie is just an awesome person. She's wise beyond her years, she's brutally honest, and a lot of fun. We only met about 6 months ago, and she's already one of my favourite people to hang out with. So yeah, without any further ado, I bring you Mackenzie Amara, the Inked Shrink. So, I'm here with my friend Mackenzie.
Yes.
So, Mackenzie, I suppose, introduce yourself in your own words, like,
oh boy,
who are you and what do you do?
I am a human. I'm a student. I'm a psychology student. I study depth psychology, Carl Jung, and doing my doctorate in clinical psych. So, looking at, my sort of proposed dissertation is looking at the dreams that people have after psychedelic experiences, attempting to link some kind of unconscious as it is revealed by the psychedelic state to the unconscious as it naturally arises in the dream state. In preliminary stages of that, kind of fleshing it out, the ideas and all of that, but yeah, that's a bit about me academically.
And this is coming from like the Jungian sort of school of psychoanalysis? Yes.
I study Jung, that's my theoretical framework for psychology, and the sort of transpersonal stuff I'm getting from Groff and Carhart Harris and Fadiman and these people.
Okay, cool. So the kind of the main topic why I wanted to sort of get this conversation on camera is that I'm doing a piece regarding ego death at the moment, and in my sort of usual way I kind of find myself like blurting out and ranting all my opinions in a perfect expression of my own ego. And I just thought, I'd take the opportunity.
Bring a second ego in.
Well, I thought I'd take the opportunity to check my ego and just make sure I'm not talking complete shit. So I suppose since it's your like area of expertise, and I think part of the trickiness around when you're talking about in psychedelics is that the word ego has a very fuzzy definition. It's thrown around as a bit of an insult. It's sort of used as a way of like sort of, enlightened people talking down to other people. But then it's also using this concept of ego death as in some kind of event, something. So what I want to try to do is to be able to talk about this, boil it down to something. So from your sort of like professional your studies perspective, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about the ego? What is it? And I suppose if we could try and get this into like radio friendly soundbite.
Yeah. So Jung holds the ego as, and I had this experience as well, and who knows if this is like my experience because I've been reading about this, or if I had the experience first and then found the words to explain it afterwards. But Jung talks about the ego as one of many complexes in the psyche, and a complex from a Jungian perspective is anything which contains both emotion and memory.
Okay.
So it's a jumble of memories that have an emotional overlay to them.
Right, okay.
complexes are always related to archetypes, and this is the thing that Jungian psychology does really well. So a complex, let's say you have a mother complex or a father complex. That is, you have a memory with a lot of emotion related to this idea of mother or this idea of father. There's also the archetypal father and the archetypal mother. Those are universal energetics that are true across cultures, across history. So each of our complexes contains an archetypal core or root. And Jung says the ego is just another one of those complexes. It's just another one of these sort of jumbles or pockets of compiled energy, memories, and emotions. He also says that the ego is the center point of all conscious self. So everything that one knows about oneself, the ego is the centering point. That can be seen from two ways. It's both the thing that you most identify with, it's like the hat that you most frequently wear, and the beam of light that you can use to shine like a tool at the other aspects of your consciousness. So I could take my ego and shine it on my relationship to mother, for example.
Okay.
So I use the ego in a kind of directed way through my own volition. And I appreciate that perspective on ego because it so easily allows for one to occupy a different seat.
Okay. So this all sounds, I mean, none of this sounds particularly like bad so far. So I guess, like, why is it this kind of framing of the ego as something to be killed, or we talk about sort of our ego like getting out of control? Like, what was,
because the ego is only in consciousness. It only involves what is known about yourself. When you're coming from a purely ego identity, or you've never stepped out of that identity, you can't uncover any of your unconscious parts. So nothing unknown gets revealed.
Okay.
That means all of your hidden motivations, which are often manipulative or childish or immature, because we're all manipulative, childish, immature beings until we're not. So hidden motivations, compulsive tendencies tend to be like, we don't know why we're compulsive, we just have the compulsion, right? Yeah. If we knew why, we probably wouldn't do it. Like personal relationship stuff, attachment wounds, all of the kind of emotional stuff that stirs drama and creates complications in our lives. Simultaneously, the kind of lack of emotion. Like I've worked with patients who feel very little, and I think that's also a very rigid ego stance. They're not letting in any of their bigger feelings, because to do so would disrupt their identity.
Is that kind of the thing about you saying about it focusing on the known? It's because so they're not letting anything in that they sort of not comfortable, like not letting in that new experience. Exactly. And I suppose is that why, because of this sort of wanting to stay in this sort of like comfort zone, for want of a better word, this is why, the sort of the ego, or people have seen it as egotistical, sort of like a clawing into what they are defining as this bandwidth of reality.
Yes, and the other thing that happens, and this is a nuance in Jungian thought that is important and kind of hard to grasp, so I might stumble. But when we don't allow, or when we're so rigidly attached to only our conscious experience of ourselves, we can be taken over by other complexes. So if I had, let's say, an authority complex, and I go into a new classroom and there's a new teacher, i.e. it's a new person in a position of authority over me, and I have an unknown authority complex, I haven't actually consciously made myself aware of this complex, and this teacher says something belittling or shaming or patronizing to me, my complex is going to take me over, and I'm going to respond in a reactionary, compulsive kind of way, thinking this is me
Yeah.
doing this, because my ego actually gets taken over, and then I'm behaving in a way that actually isn't really grounded or authentic or responsive. It's reactionary, because the ego is very liable to kind of just get taken unless you've really examined what you are and what you are not. Which is where the idea of ego death, I think, comes in, is that it allows for us to go kind of on the via negativa, that I'm not this, not this, not this, right? Like that's what dies when something dies, is everything that you are not.
So is it that when you talk about these complexes, is there a kind of like a baseline complex, and that, I mean, am I in a sort of complex mode now, or am I being dictated by one, or I'm just trying to work out how that line works?
Complexes are always feeling toned. That's the phrase that we use. So you'll know that you're kind of hooked by a complex when there's an inordinate amount of feeling for what the experience is.
Yeah, I think yeah, we're all sort of
we've all experienced that. It's very human, and I think any kind of psychodynamic psychotherapy will focus on ego strength and ego health, meaning the ability to be flexible and not rigid in my engagement with the world. So when I am overcome by a complex, I have the flexibility and the responsiveness to be like, oh, that's actually triggering a lot of memories from this other time that I was dealing with an authority figure and I got, humiliated or whatever. That doesn't have to do with this experience that I'm having right now. So that ability to kind of separate, pause, say, that's not me.
Right.
That's the complex.
And is this? Can you do this? Like,
please.
Because it's one of these things, when you talk about like sort of mindfulness and like meditation and stuff like that, and it's this ability to sort of step back. But I struggle with that. I'm just wondering, like, is this some sort of superpower you can sort of attain to? Because I'd love to not be a dick. But it's tough.
Well, okay, so this is the other thing about this. No, I'm not going to go there yet. I think that I can do this when I've chosen to do it. Like if I'm working with a patient, I fully step into the container and know, okay, I'm separating myself from my kind of typical bullshit humanness, so that I can be a clear container for this person. And
but I think it's like I say, that's like a kind of, that is a sort of a container that you're stepping in. It's a persona that you're sort of then adopting, and I think that the tricky part is to, can you maintain that sort of non-stop? But sorry, I interrupted you. Like,
no, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, I think more and more, Jung said that the first half of life is really about ego development. You're learning the role that you want to have in the world. So it actually is, I mean, if you're doing it well and appropriately, you actually are getting kind of a not bigger ego, but stronger ego, healthier ego, as you figure out right livelihood, how you make money, as you figure out relationship and family ties, whether that's cutting family ties or bringing new ones in or whatever. What kind of personality like you appreciate in other people and in yourself, how you want to dress, how you want to eat, like all of that stuff is ego strengthening. It's ego syntonic. And then there are things that kind of, I think, happen in the second half of life, not speaking from experience, but like that are ego dystonic, that is ego annihilating. They cause you to question this identity that you've created for yourself. And the more rigidly one is attached to their external identity, their social role, their role in the community, how they make money, their kind of status, or I don't know, like the shell of the person, like I'm a this, I'm a that. The more attached you are in that, the harder the second half of life is going to be, because the less flexible and able to contend with the kind of spiritual weight of death you're going to be, really, is what it is.
So I think, again, just coming back to this kind of point of like, the concept itself is not inherently sort of bad. So with what you're describing, how do you think this kind of maps onto how the term is used in the sort of psychedelic space? Is like, are we talking about the same thing?
Yes and no. So, I think one of the words that does need to be really clarified in kind of talking about these two worlds is the word consciousness. Because in the psychedelic world, we use the word consciousness as the fundamental underlying isness animating all of reality.
Yeah.
It is a universal base truth that is indefinable and ineffable and exists everywhere a priori perennially, right?
Yeah, everything happens within consciousness.
Right. And Jung would say, and interestingly, so would some Advaita teachers like Nisargadatta, that consciousness is always only ever conscious of something.
Okay.
So consciousness is not a base fact. Consciousness is a subject of an object, or an object of a subject.
Okay.
That awareness is that there is an a priori something. Jung would call it the secret order. He also uses the word pleroma, which comes from Gnosticism. He uses the word self with a capital S a lot. Nisargadatta or Advaita teachers would say awareness, but that consciousness is conscious of something.
Okay.
Which is where the ego comes in. The ego then becomes the director of consciousness.
Yeah.
It's the light of the flashlight. So the flashlight is consciousness, ego is the light. Where do I want to shine the light of my consciousness? And you can shine that on inner figures, i.e. on unconscious things, to kind of lift them up, which I think is what happens in the psychedelic space, is that your own inner shit or angels, like be them good things or bad things, get lifted up into the light of consciousness. You become aware of them.
Yeah. I think that might be something why there's this sort of feeling of ancestry and stuff that comes up, or this feeling of lineage. And certainly all these archetypes that come up. So I would lean more towards that, where you just it's the spotlight is kind of spreading as it were.
Absolutely. And something in that, or where I think ego death gets really interesting from a Jungian perspective. So if we're talking about psyche as kind of a stratified, let's say, bit of earth, right? So there's different layers, like there are in the Earth's crust.
Yeah, sediment sort of thing.
Yeah. So we've got your kind of personal consciousness, what you know about yourself. That's maybe all the flora and fauna that you see. And then you've got kind of the topsoil would be just the personal unconscious. Family stuff, personal memories, childhood stuff, your relationship to food, sex, money, all of this stuff that you've learned as a human this lifetime. And then Jung says that there's another layer, the collective unconscious, which is where archetypal experiences live. That's where a lot of people, I think, get into that very quickly when they start working with psychedelics.
Yeah.
They move past their personal history into their collective history, whether that's collective with just their family unit, i.e. your ancestors, like you said, or collective like the whole of humanity and all of living organisms, like you're meeting the world tree from 2 million years ago kind of thing, right? That could be said to be an ancestor. It's also archetypal. Every single text has a world tree, so that as an example. Or you're experiencing like the Big Bang or the flood that started it all, or whatever, like like these archetypal experiences, and that's another layer of psyche. And in order to get to those places, I mean, I would say yes, there does need to be an ego death. That almost feels a little bit too extreme. There needs to be a loosening of attachment to ego. Like, ego doesn't need to die, and I feel kind of ambivalent about this as a goal for people, because it's a suicide mission. By definition, it's a suicide mission, and the pitfalls and dangers on that mission are so numerous. It's like it's not even something that people should attempt to do. If it happens, it's a good idea to know what just happened, but I think reaching for it as a goal it's a suicide mission, and it doesn't get you where you want to be.
So is the label correct then? So we talk, because I think when you talk about ego death, I mean, I think first of all, it doesn't die. I don't think. I mean, because that is one of the kind of the cliches in this kind of psychedelic community. Like, you have this ego death, you're enlightened, you just sort of float around on your cloud, and I think that's blatantly not true. We can get into that in a moment. But so it's not gone. So death seems like the wrong word for it. And as you kind of described, I'm not even sure that the ego part of ego death is even the right word. It seems to me more it's this kind of, I don't know, this kind of hippie and redefine things now. But is it like is sort of consciousness broadening not like a better sort of?
Maybe, yeah. I think the way that I've come to understand it in my own experience and from reading extensively is like that one actually needs to have a strong ego, a strong sense of who one is to be engaging with these archetypal forces, because otherwise, just like complexes, they'll overpower you. And I think that this is what happens, and Jung even writes about this, and he wasn't writing about this in the psychedelic state, he was writing about it from having worked with dreams and imagination, really. That what, like, you'll have a visionary experience of being Christ on the cross, or of being Buddha becoming enlightened under the Bodhi tree, and your without awareness of what is your ego and what is the archetypal experience, the two fuse, and then you are just Christ, with no ability to differentiate, like to discern, that's an experience that my ego is having. I am not that. It's again that process of not that one needs to be deeply engaged in, to keep that discerning kind of healthy distance, to bask in the experience while it's happening, and fully allow it, like whatever energy that is, to infuse you, be it terrifying or beautiful. But then when the time comes to say, right, okay, now I'm back to being mundane me.
Yeah. And
it's a drag. Like, that's a very annoying thing to be once you've opened the doors.
I think it's good that what you just said about sort of ego strengthening. Again, this is why I don't like the kind of this emphasis on sort of ego death and ego is bad, because that's the bit you need. You need to actually have this strong ego to process this event. You have this, call it ego dissolution or consciousness, whatever, but when you do come back from it to the mundane, it is you who's got to process it and do something useful with it. And if you don't have that strength of doing it, then you do end up like, the guy who, or, the person that we would say is like, that person's lost their mind. They think they're stuck in some sort of psychedelic loop, or they think they're on the cross or whatever. So I think that's a kind of a weird sort of framing of it then, is like, why is it seen as like ego death is a good thing, whereas really we should be saying that ego strengthening is the thing. We should be looking to make this, and this is possibly like pure heresy now.
I mean, it's not wrong though, and like I think, yeah, perhaps it is heresy, but I think that it's a misnomer and a misunderstanding of, really, I don't actually think it's a misunderstanding of ego death, because I think phenomenologically it's true, like whether I have a strong ego or a weak ego, the experience of ego death is the same. Well, okay, so what's heretical, I think, about talking about the unviability or undesirability of ego death is that we're kind of sold from the enlightened masters, who appear to be and communicate being in a state of perfect peace and bliss. We're sold that is that's the package that will open in the present that is gift wrapped ego death. So you think that you're going for peace and bliss. What you don't realize is that that's not a given, that the ego death experience does not guarantee that. All that it does is open you up to whatever the fuck is in your unconscious, like, and collective, like, for a moment. Adyashanti is another spiritual teacher that I appreciate, and he talks about non-dual awareness versus abiding non-dual awareness. And I think that we are given the story that a single ego death experience will deliver us into abiding non-dual awareness, this place of perfect peace and perfect bliss.
And that's definitely what's kind of
and that's not the
narrative.
case.
Yeah.
And when you have that ego death experience and you go through all of that terror and all of that dismemberment and all of that dissociation and all of that disillusionment, and then you're not given perfect peace and everlasting bliss, it just fucking sucks to start with. Like, God damn it. But of course we're not told that you don't get that guaranteed, because then nobody's going to do it. And if you're enlightened and you're selling enlightenment, you don't want to tell people that you may not get what you paid for. And all of that hard work that you go into sacrificing yourself on the cross, and literally the suicide mission that is ego death, doing that for however long you do it, to then get onto the other side and be like, shit, I'm exactly the same person when I put my clothes on in the morning, and I have all of the same stuff, and I still have to talk to the same people, and I have to do the same job. My life is not changed. I just now don't exist in it. That's not a good thing. Nobody would buy that. So that's the part that's heretical about this, is that when ego death becomes a mission, people can sell it.
Yeah. And I think this is why, one of the reasons I'm making this video is that I think the phrases are kind of like grossly misapplied, and I think just the thing that people are after, they are after that peace and sort of happiness, or possibly just even after just getting incredibly high and just just like having their minds blown. But yeah, I think that they're not necessarily really sort of soundly thinking that I'm just going to blow up on the firewall here. I'm just going to drop all my sort of psychological defenses and let it sort of run wild with me.
Right.
Because again, which kind of comes to the point, like, is ego death necessarily a good thing or a desirable thing? And I think there are probably places where it can be but it seems like it's just some sort of given, and almost to the point of comedy on if in on like you see like people call it eagle death and igloo death, and I find that stuff hilarious. But it's just so it's become like a kind of a cliche almost, and I think that's one of those kind of things where for pedantic twat like me, then I just kind of sort of read it, I'm like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, people.
I mean, I have the same response. Because I was one of those people. I bought into the myth that my problems were that I had an ego. My problem was that I had an ego, and therefore to get rid of my problems I had to kill my ego. And that was a 10-year quest. It was a lot of fucking silent meditation and a lot of psychedelics and heroic doses and a lot of fasting and a lot of just anything that somebody could throw at my ego, I would imbibe it in whatever form it came in. And to do that whole process and then kind of come through on the other side, having gotten, I'm not going to say, well, whatever. I got the answer that stopped me asking the question, which I guess was...
Right, here we go, folks. This is it.
No. That, like, I don't even know what the answer was. I had the visceral experience that after that experience, I no longer had any questions. So after 10 years of asking the same question, to not have a single question, it was like, I guess the question's answered. Like, that's all that I can really say about the experience, was that I guess my question was answered because the question doesn't exist in my being anymore.
Okay.
But I wasn't a better person, and I didn't feel better, and I wasn't happier. And what I discovered in that is that actually what I should have been... should is the wrong word. What I've been doing now since that experience is this process that I'm talking about of strengthening my ego, healing my ego, so that I can be flexible, responsive, and adaptive in the world. The world that I'm in most of the time, the world that we're all in most of the time, because I'm only in psychedelic spaces a small portion of the time. which hopefully is true for all of us.
For some people.
There was certainly a time in my life when it was a higher portion, but that this healing, this that actually what needed to happen and what's been needing to happen this whole time is that I've needed to become okay with just being a person, and that the quest to kill my ego was an extreme dissatisfaction with existence. Like at its core, it was fundamentally sadistic. That this is so awful to me that I need to die to bear it. Like just that idea in and of itself is nuts. You're not doing anything to make your life better, to find joy in yourself, to find love in your heart, to feel good in your body. You're single-mindedly trying to kill yourself to then find joy and peace in your... It just makes no sense. Like, just focus on the things that you want to cultivate in yourself.
And people go to extreme lengths as well to do that. And like I say, it does become a sort of... I think it's weird to say it because there's an element of sort of torturing yourself to do it. And I think possibly on some level, because you kind of... It is almost like unattainable in a kind of in this instance, then you kind of know that on some level, so you're torturing yourself even more to do it, and just kind of denying yourself all this kind of this human experience. And at the same time, I think completely tricking yourself into thinking you were achieving something, and so then you end up sort of again, you do get these people who are very kind of like sniffing their own farts of like, because I have done this, then I am this. And it's a weird kind of thought loop thing. I don't want to give the impression that I'm not saying it's not worthwhile to pursue these things. I mean, clearly I try and pursue it myself, but it almost seems like a weird feedback loop.
Totally. And again, this is why I think Jungian psychology is so masterful at engaging this, because it really is a psychology of the unconscious. So when you're dealing with questions of ego and kind of going under, i.e. going into your unconscious, whether it's by choice or forced via more psychedelics than you meant to take, or in dreams, we all have unconscious experiences when we dream. The ego that is not discerning and differentiated and healthy and flexible is liable to being completely overpowered by one of these archetypes. And that those archetypes include the shadow. So you can be possessed by your shadow. And this is what we think of as demonic possession. This is what we think of when we think of a criminally insane person. This is somebody that's actually been possessed by something that is in their unconscious that for their entire life they failed to recognize. So part of what ego strengthening is learning to embrace these things that we've dissociated from in ourselves. The first of which is always the shadow, because the shadow is always antithetical to, if ego is the bright light of consciousness, shadow is the dark pit of the unconscious. So it's anything that your ego has found disagreeable to such an extreme that it's separated it. So I'm a good person. If I'm a good person, I can very well guarantee that there's a bad impulse back here somewhere. Robert Bly refers to the shadow as the long black bag that we drag behind us. And I love that, because you're never separated from this bag. And every once in a while, something crawls out of that bag and it's like, ooh, steal that candy bar. Or like, oh, why don't you cheat on your wife?
Oh my God.
Or like,
stop the camera.
And we see this, we see this kind of possession in... That is what a compulsion is, right? You're possessed by a demon. You're possessed by something that your ego finds disagreeable. Food binging is a great example. My ego doesn't want to eat a whole pizza. I don't consciously choose to do that. If I am possessed by something in my shadow, something that I've disowned, I compulsively do that. I can't stop myself. Any addiction could be explained through this lens. And part of what happens when we're in the psychedelic space, when we enter into these unconscious realms and we don't have this healthy ego, this resilient ego, flexible ego, we're so much more liable to possession. And a lot of the things that exist in our unconscious are demonic, just by the nature that they've been in the dark for a really long time. Anything that grows up in the dark is gonna have teeth and fangs. Even if it's ultimately a really good thing, like I'm gonna keep going with the food thing, there's probably a symbolic layer to that addiction. Something having to do with mother and how you nourish yourself, how you nurture yourself, how you want to matter, i.e. incorporate in your body. So there's something about your body and your physicality and your nourishment that has become shadowy. You get possessed by it. So in working with that shadow, that complex, you can learn to actually nourish yourself skillfully, healthfully, with integrity, with consciousness. But you need to deal with the shadow part. You need to understand what it's actually trying to get you to do. And when we're in the psychedelic space, these, because everything is magnified and amplified, these possessive qualities, these possessive others, inner others, a phrase that I really like is the committee. So we've got like this committee of inner figures, and they can, any one of them, when they take the throne, so to speak, will overpower you, like I said, but they'll be kind of a teleos, or there's a goal direction inside of them if you understand what their purpose is. But again, you need that discerning, differentiating quality of ego, of consciousness, to be able to grok what the purpose of this demonic character is.
So yeah, I was going to sort of say that. Is there a mechanism here? Like, is when we talk about these things, these complexes taking over us, which yeah, clearly they do. I think everyone can sort of relate to this. There must be some sort of like reason that's happening. It's we can sort of recognize it as like a bad. I mean, I do it. Kid does something stupid, I flip out at my kid, and I'm like, and then I'm like, oh shit, I shouldn't have done that. But what's the why? What's the reason then? Why am I losing my shit?
Yeah, Jung says that he's got this great line that, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the mere darkness of being, or in the darkness of mere being. So when something like that, when we get overpowered by an unconscious content, I think the first purpose of it is to become conscious of it. This is what consciousness raising actually is just becoming conscious of your own unconscious shit as it moves through you and as it makes you something that you are not actually. The other kind of purpose, and this one's a little bit more nebulous, is ultimately to this idea of strengthening the ego, but strengthening it for what, or in what way. Jung says that the purpose of the ego, of having a strong ego, is so that you can relate to the self, the archetypal God, the universal. Can we just before you go any further, can we just slice that up then a little bit? So yeah. What's the self in relation to the ego? So, self is Jung's word for the totality of isness, of being. Okay. That is inclusive of collective unconscious contents, personal unconscious contents, and conscious contents. So like everything I am, but also I'm not aware of. Yeah. Just. So part of myself as somebody of Ukrainian, North European descent would be like the Valkyries and the shaman of northern Russia and the Norse pantheon, right? That's all part of my particular collective unconscious because it's in my psychic DNA. It's been passed. I'm from Manchester. That's it. That's it. But you're not. That's the thing. I mean, I'm from fucking California. Just like fly the flag for how exotic you are. Like. I don't get to claim ownership. Just pull out your DNA test, Mackenzie. Like, oh, check me out. I don't own that. I just happen to have it. And each of us has this kind of psychic blueprint, this psychic DNA. And fundamentally, it's all the same. like when we get back far enough, we come from one ancestor, right?
Yeah.
So like the psychic blueprint, you take it far back enough and we're the same fucking person. But of course we're not, because we've differentiated into these and small little individual things. But so the idea of the self is kind of the whole totality of known and unknown parts, as are available or can become available to you, like the ones that potentially exist in your field.
Okay.
So having worked in psychedelic spaces with my ancestors, I can now kind of have access to their power or their story. I can root into that if my ego, for example, is feeling small and unconfident, I can kind of tap into, let's say, some Viking energy from that sort of ancestral level, and maybe I have a little bit more access. There's like a through road for a bit more of that consciousness to come through me.
Is that what kind of like gives such kind of power to things like sort of when you have these kind of collective identities, like sort of, when people start seeing themselves as, this tribe or this thing, is that what that, because I mean the sort of the typical probably quite topical thing is things around like sort of like riots and things like that, and you sort of it's very relatable because you understand the sort of the feeling of this collectiveness, but also it's frightening to.
Absolutely.
So is that kind of, is that where that's coming from, do you think?
Just like an individual can be possessed by something in their personal or collective unconscious, a collective can be possessed as well. And I think particularly in the neo-Nazi realm is a really easy place to go to look at this, that there's a possession of, and Jung even talked about this, he said a Wotanic spirit, like the deity Wotan, who's Odin in the Norse pantheon, that's of Germanic descent, it's a war god, it's like race driven and oriented, and that there's a possession by a mass of people by this kind of missing aspect of their collective ancestry. They're not consciously acknowledging this part of their ancestry, so then it is coming through the unconscious to possess them, which is the same way that it works in an individual. If I haven't dealt with my mother complex, I'm going to have some food or body issues, probably, symbolically speaking. So yeah, that is what we're seeing in the kind of riots and the mass takeover that happens in groups. It's the exact same thing. Yeah,
I think that when you mentioned sort of like the German thing, and you see in these kind of like these World War II era speeches, and if you sort of watch one, you get it, like they're
possessed.
Yeah, and it's. And the sort of the language, I won't even say it's a language game. It's something is being transmitted that, I've got to be careful with my words, but it's
effective.
You can sort of get when you got this little weird dude with this crazy comb over, but it's like banging on the 1,000-year right and all this. You're like, the power is there, and maybe that's again that me is like sort of white European sort of feeling that as part of my sort of collective unconsciousness. But yeah, it's a.
And I mean, like, I'm about to perhaps eat shit, but that feeling that is transmitted from an orator who is possessed like that is the same kind of transmission that happens from an enlightened person, from somebody that just on the other side. Like, here's a person that is possessed by something demonic and shadowy versus somebody that is possessed by something angelic and celestial. The transmission of something otherworldly, of something transpersonal, is the same. The content of that transmission, obviously incredibly different. The effect of that transmission, obviously incredibly different. But the mechanism is the same. What's happening is the same.
Yeah, you're tapping into that. I mean, I guess it is that thing that sort of most people who've had psychedelics can relate to. It is that mystical experience, and it's that sort of possibly the thing that's kind of so much missing in the world, that there's just that waterfall of meaning that just, and it's like, yes, and you sort of, you feel it in sort of, whenever you feel like you're onto some sort of righteous cause and something like that, and it's a freakishly sort of powerful effect. I wonder when you just mentioned there with like the sort of the angelic versus the demonic, like the line there seems like,
yeah, and this is why this, again, I'm going to say this word a million times because it's so important. Discernment. Like, this is why ego strength is absolutely imperative, that you know what you are and what you are not, specifically what you are not, that you are not an angel, you are not a demon, you are not responsible to change the world, you are not going to change the world, you're not anything until you are that thing. Like, you're any imagination of who you are, or the effect that you're going to have, none of that is true, and it is a result of possession. So that ability to discern in the moment, and this is, I think we see this a lot in psychedelic spaces where there is kind of a guru complex, or there is some brainwashing happening, where somebody does get kind of possessed by that power. Oh, and I want to say, like, in the idea of being possessed by power, or possessed by love, possessed by anything, part of what's so attractive about that is you become limitless. When you have access to the entire pantheon of your unconscious and the collective unconscious, you're infinite. You can be any of the archetypes as needed, as they come through you. Like, and that feeling of being infinite and limitless is, of course, phenomenal. I mean, you're a deluge, like, and ego is inherently yours. It's inherently a one thing, and if it's a one thing, that means it's limited. A one thing. So that feeling feels very confining. It makes, there's the line in Aladdin that I love when Genie opens up to Genie, says, "Phenomenal cosmic consciousness, itty bitty living space." And there's a way in which I think dealing with these energies can kind of feel like that. Like, you tap into this phenomenal cosmic consciousness, and then you're in this itty bitty living space, and you can't possibly hold on to all of those, but you try to, because that feels way better. You feel way fuller in that than in the mundane this. And especially if your ego is an ego that's experienced some battering, like if you've lived through some trauma, or you have some baggage, or you've made some mistakes, you don't want to come back to that. Like, nothing in you wants to occupy that after you've been healed, after you've tapped into angel heaven's bliss, which is where bliss junkies come from. Like, you just kind of keep yourself up and up and up and in that infinite, but the problem is you're not actually doing anything about yourself in the here and now, about this planet, about this time, about your relationships, and then there's no fucking point. Then you're just becoming a god to become a god, and congratulations. Like, big deal. Yeah, cheers.
I mean, there's a couple of things. I think when you talk about, like, sort of like that sort of cult mentality, I can see the attraction, because there's a dual thing there. On the one hand, you are being enlightened and you are expanding your consciousness, but also you're ticking the box of servitude as well. So you're in service to this thing. So you're humble as well as sort of inflated, and I can see again it's a very sort of delicious sort of loop to get caught in.
Absolutely, and I think especially for the Western ego, which has been so subjected to being subservient, whether it's from Mother Church or Father Government or school or strict parents or all of the above, like, we actually really enjoy. Part of our cultural complex is that we enjoy having somebody tell us what to do, particularly in this country where we find ourselves right now.
You have no idea.
So this is like another aspect of what's going on, is that there's the way that we've been enculturated to want a higher up, whether that's in the etheric, imaginal, archetypal realm, or whether it's a concrete person like a guru or a church or the state or our parents or whatever, we want actually that feeling of tell me what to do, because it actually feels a lot safer to not have a really strong, healthy ego. Because to have a strong, healthy ego in the world often means that you're excluding yourself from certain groups, from certain events. You're making yourself a little bit lonely, because you're not just going to go along with what's happening.
Yeah.
So this like parental complex can become really extreme in the archetypal spaces or in the psychedelic spaces, and why so many people, I think, are liable to being brainwashed or being taken into somebody's thrall is because we all want somebody to tell us what to do. That's so much fucking easier. Are you kidding?
Yeah, and especially in it's one of the kind of like the weird things with sort of like, particularly when you end up in these retreat environments, because you've got people there who are like they know they're there for something. They're coming there for some kind of thing, but then it's almost too easy to be sort of like handed that if you go through this, then you are fixed. You are then sort of enlightened or whatever, and yeah, you follow this shaman or this teaching, and it's done. And then I've talked quite a bit on this channel about seeing people who come out the other side of it, and their heads just collapse because it's. I mean, first they possibly weren't ready for the experience in the first place, and again, that's not me saying I'm some sort of awesome strength of character. It's pure accident that I'm not, that I did end up with my head at my own ass. But yeah, and again, it's just like they were looking for this kind of this peace and sort of that's what they were after, this peace and happiness, and which I think is what all that anybody's after. But yeah, it's you throw open these floodgates and you just overpowered. And so yeah, I would kind of lean towards like should people be searching for ego death? Let's have a yay or nay on it.
No, I think if it happens, it's absolutely imperative that you understand what just happened to you and seek support and seek help in integrating that experience. But it should be a byproduct of something that you were doing for just for your own exploration. Like to be going for it, you're gonna be disappointed. Like it's not going to give you what you think that what you think it's going to give you. What I will say though is that when it comes to dealing with the realm of the gods, obviously the best place to look for how to deal with that is to stories and myths that deal with the realms of the gods. So in Jungian psychology we use a lot of myth, and pretty much every human that attempts to become godly experiences some kind of deep humiliation as a result of their attempt. Prometheus stealing fire from Zeus or from Mount Olympus is a great example. He was then punished to have his liver
eaten out by vultures or something,
vultures every single
harpies
day.
Or something, yeah.
And what this means, and humiliation and humble actually share a root. That a humiliating experience is one that makes you more human. And what ego death can do, if held in the right container, is humble the ego. It can humiliate you so fully in your humanness, i.e. make you so undeniably human. You shit, you make mistakes, you fuck, you are messy, you're imperfect, you're so fundamentally flawed. And making you that, like, that's the benefit of ego death. If you're not willing to have that be your experience, you're doing the wrong thing. You're attempting to become godly take fire from the gods, which will be punished. Like every single story, every single personal experience that I've had, that my close friends have had, that my patients have had, you fall on your face eventually.
Okay, intermission, beep, cut. So, last thing I wanted to kind of like pick your brains about. It's not last thing because we're still on the same topic. But yeah, I was on your Instagram, and you did this post which I really related to, and again it was on this kind of topic of ego, and it was about ego specifically in relation to social media and this kind of, there's a very wholesome sort of desire to broadcast, to sort of, you know, I think you use the phrase like share knowledge, and I'd like to think of myself that that's what I'm doing most of the time, is that I'm trying to share my knowledge, and I'm just doing that purely for that sort of reason. But the act of doing it itself, again, it's this kind of feedback loop that we're talking about. It starts to encroach back into it, and then I give a shit about how it's being received, and that begins to influence me, and then, you know, people are commenting on things, and I struggle with this. I'm gonna I think that's what you perfectly encapsulated in this post. And the thing I kind of wanted to hold you to task for, like, right, what the fuck are we doing about it? Don't just tell me about it. What's the solution, Doc?
So,
or what's your take on it? Like, I mean, how have you found dealing with this kind of phenomenon?
the beauty of looking at psychological development as something that is a kind of team effort with your ego, is that we can tap into, like, another way of referring to the archetypal would be the godly, as I have been. But there are certain things that are godly just in personality, like talent and charisma, for example. The root of both of these words, talent is silver coins or gold coins that you start off with. It's money already in the bank.
Okay.
That's the...
Is that the actual meaning? Yeah.
That's the actual meaning of that word. Charisma is the root in the gods. Charisma has something to do with being tapped into the gods. So there are things that we can be born with that are about us, in us, available to us, that are naturally already kind of tapped into that infinite potential space. Which is why we follow charismatic leaders, because we're getting a transmission, like we were speaking about earlier, we're getting a transmission that feels godly, that feels powerful, infinite somehow. But I think when it comes to sharing gifts and strengths, to come at it from a place of this is mine, i.e. ego, where I'm owning it and possessing it. I'm not actually possessing it, I'm being possessed by it. And then I care deeply about how people respond to it. Versus taking the big picture angle, the wide angle lens, and seeing, oh, this is something that I've been given that is coming through me. It's not actually mine, I'm just stewarding it. It's like land that you own.
Yeah, like a conduit sort of thing.
You're stewarding this land. There's a poet, Jane something, a quote of hers that I love. She says, be a good steward of your gifts.
Yeah.
And I so appreciate that, because I think that when we have a weak ego, or an ego that is prone to inflation or deflation, i.e. believing it's bigger than it is or believing that it's smaller than it is, and that is the same thing. When our ego is prone to that, we take our gifts and they become contorted. They become something that I'm rigidly holding on to. I'm doling them out to only specific people and in a very particular way, and I need it to be received in only this way, and we get smaller and smaller and smaller and more confined in our expression of what is actually a gift that has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And this, creatives talk about this all the time, that they're just clearing the channel, opening up for whatever wants to come through. Leonard Cohen's great line about this, he says, he's speaking about himself in the third person. He says he's just a lazy bastard living in a suit, a brief elaboration of a tube. And I love that. Like, he's just a fucking tube, briefly for a moment, putting whatever comes through, spews through the tube out. And it's when we get attached to the outcome, that's where the ego is. And where I've been in relating to my own social media presence is almost like an experiment, a psychological experiment on myself, of watching my ego either get big or get small in people's response. So if I can detach enough to see, ooh, wow, that's inflating me like crazy, and now I really want to control the flow of this thing, or, oh wow, I feel really small now because nobody liked my post. So if I can detach enough to watch my own roller coaster ride, it becomes kind of an interesting strengthening exercise. Like I've just social media is my ego gym, where I can go to the gym and I can work out the muscle, and if I watch the way that the muscle grows or diminishes in response to its stimulation, then I'm understanding my ego a lot better, and can thus be more adaptive and flexible and responsive, and all of these things that we're trying to hone when we strengthen the ego.
I'm gonna have to remember, because that's a couple of fucking great phrases. Like, so ego gym, and the steward of your gift. So I mean, I just what sort of sprang to mind when you said that sort of quotation was how obscene it would be if, say, if it's sort of like, the steward or the curator of a museum, if they were like, this is mine, like I own this dinosaur bones, like this is mine, and I'm going to show we would universally look at that as putrid. But and the sort of the benevolent one of like, bask, everyone please come and learn all there is to learn, and what I have I give to you, and it's here and I will maintain. So we would see that as virtuous, and I think that's the thing that sort of first attracts people to these kind of like social media platforms, is this kind of like very selfless, just let me put it out there and do what you want with it. But again, like the process itself is weird. I mean,
totally. And again, back to this idea of ego syntonic and dystonic, like certain aspects of social media can really strengthen. Like I've certainly had the experience of like, oh wow, positive response. Okay, like I must actually be good at talking about this shit. Cool. Didn't know that. Now I know. That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. I don't feel more arrogant now.
Particularly if you get something back where it has, someone tells you it has helped them, and they come back with a sincere message of like, you think that, yeah, that's good. But it's the thing that kind of trumps those experiences when someone just says, just give you a little stroke, and that's the weird bit, I think.
Right. Totally. And again, that's the realm of gods. That's taking ownership over something that's not actually yours or you. It's saying, I did that, you did not do that. I guarantee when you sat down to write that poem or opened your mouth to speak, you didn't have it fully conceived in your ego consciousness. Some other aspect came through in the moment, some muse, some unconscious bit, some wordplay, something that you didn't conceive of. It came through. That's just what happens. You don't get to own that. It's not yours. It happened. It's just part of the field. You are the radio channel tuner, tuned into the right fucking frequency, but the frequency already existed. That radio channel exists whether you're tuning into it or not, right? So it's the ownership of the thing after you've created it that I think our ego gets really like...
Do you think... Can you feel it? So I guess what I'm getting at here is that I've done things which have felt, for want of a better, like spiritually aligned with me, and I thought, okay, this is a good, and it's not that I didn't care how it was received, but I felt it was truth. I thought it was truth. And then there's some things, and I'll have to hold my hands up on it where I thought it was. I think it comes back to that phrase of possession that you were talking about before, like that I just did, or I just said I was ranting or something like that, and it's not that it was insincere or I was doing it for somebody, but it wasn't as true as some of the sort of the true things, and I think that's the thing that kind of social media sort of concocts out of people, and it can become quite ugly. And I think we've probably all seen this in like very sort of like online people, is where you can almost see the point where like the I don't know, maybe sellout's too strong a word, but it's that transition to
doing it for the doing it for the response. I mean, I think a really useful kind of way to concretize this idea is like, where do you get defensive, and where are you unavailable to make a mistake or admit once you have made a mistake? Where can you not apologize? If in a social media sphere, you create something and get some sort of pushback and you find yourself being incredibly defensive, I think that like there's when you're coming from, like you said, this kind of aligned place, you're in integrity, you're rooted, you're connected, it's coming through you, you don't necessarily feel the need to like defend it or explain it. Because you understand that it exists outside of you too. When you get defensive, it's because you feel like somebody's attacking you and you're threatened. And maybe they are. But that defensiveness, and this is why like the idea of defensiveness, Freud only talked about ego defenses. He didn't talk about defenses. He talked about ego defenses. All of these defenses, denial, repression, aggression, acting out, splitting, dissociation, like all of these defenses are in defense of the ego. They are there to protect the sanctity of the identity. So when you feel a defensiveness around something, probably a good indicator that your ego has like put a little bit more value or a bit more of your own identity, your own self in the creation. The other thing that I'll say is that like because the ego is always in opposition to the shadow, and typically what lives in our shadow are some things that we find, like I said, distasteful or ugly in some way, the ego doesn't want to apologize. It doesn't want to admit that it's made a mistake, because to do so would be to admit that it's flawed, i.e. it would be humbling. You would no longer be godly. Only the gods can be unflawed. To be flawed is to be human. Ego doesn't want to be human. It wants to be the god. So in a position of, hey, you fucked up, you said something wrong, you hurt this group of people, or like what you said got misinterpreted and now is being used by alt-right, like the shadow aspect of whatever you put out there is getting misunderstood somehow, and the ability to say, oh wow, I see how that's true. Okay, I might have made a mistake. Like that, like there's egg on my face. I just publicly fucked up. That's something that is entirely missing in social media. There's a phrase that I really love in this context, which is called learning in public. That when you make a mistake, be willing to learn in public. If you genuinely like check in your own integrity, it actually is a mistake. Like, oh, I didn't actually mean to say that, I got carried away, or whatever it is. Learn in public. Mea culpa. Like,
I think that's possibly one of the tricky things with, I mean, social media is like very new, but it is actually quite difficult to apologize in public, or to have that apology be accepted without completely throwing yourself on your sword and just sort of diminishing everything else. But I mean, you see this with like celebrities all the time, where you have to crawl, and I'm not sure that's entirely healthy. I think we've not quite worked out this. Like, how can you walk something back? It's something we're learning, I think.
Absolutely, and like we're not good at being egoed people all the time. Like, we're not made to do that, you know? Tribal cultures spend a lot of their time in communion with the gods so that they don't have to take not consciously, but like in communion with the gods, you're not taking responsibility for your own individual ego consciousness. You're in communion with gods. You're fucking channeling Oshun or whatever it is that you're channeling. Like, that's not you, that's her. There's no responsibility that one needs to take. Anything goes in that space you're possessed. And it's tribally sanctified, right? We don't have a culture of responsible ownership and like driving the ego societally. So anytime that somebody does show a little bit of humility, does learn in public, does stop defending their ego, like we're defending it against other people. Because other people are demons. Other people are terrible and want us to fail. So there's not like a culturally...
Or even of the collectives, I think it is at the moment. That's it. It's you end up with the individual versus like the mob.
Right. And the mob doesn't want an individual, because to be an individual in the face of the mob takes power from the mob, and of course the mob wants to maintain its power. So we're like, when we're defensive, it often is for a good reason. Like, it's a good idea to protect the sanctity of your actions and yourself from the powers that be, if the powers that be want to like wish you harm. And yeah, you're right, like we don't really have a culture of, hey, I made a mistake, but I'm still the same person. In fact, I'm a bigger person than that. I'm a better person than that. Like people microscopically pay attention to like the one little error, and then there's no humanity. Again, this is this like enculturated perfectionism where one mistake is your end because everybody needs to be perfect because I need to be perfect. It's like an inability to recognize my own imperfection in forcing everybody else to be perfect.
Yeah.
So we can't apologize publicly because that means that you're actually human, and God forbid you be human because then I have to be human and I don't want to be fucking human.
I've got, you know, when you were talking about like sort of like putting your identity in like in this sort of one thing, I've got a great, remind me of this later, I've got a great example. I'm not going to show it on camera because it's fucking embarrassing. But let me just say, like for anyone who's noticed, like at some point in my teenage years I got my nose broke and it was because of my fucking ego. So
yeah, see, that's the Promethean moment.
We'll talk about that. Okay, listen, this has been awesome, and you know, we could go about this whole time. Let's try and let's wrap this up then. And
right.
Like what's so? I guess how could we summarize all this? Like sort of. Let me sort of try. I think the things that I've really gotten from it. First of all, you know, thank you so much. This is such a fucking cool conversation. I love this. I'm sure we'll carry on with this for the rest of the night. But in the context of my audience and this psychedelic conversation, I think what you said about ego strengthening, regardless of what people think about ego death and sort of whether they agree with the definitions that I will put forward in sort of video or that you put forward, I think this idea of ego strengthening is such a fucking, I mean, it's just a common sense concept, and I think it's something that we really need to get into the discourse, because no matter what happens on these psychedelic ordeals that sort of people think through, whether it's an ayahuasca retreat or whether it's sort of doing something in their own space, you do have to bring it back to here. And this is something I've said time and time again on this channel. You know, whatever you believe about sort of what comes next or what came before, you are in this instance at the moment. I think that's kind of more or less undeniable. And so, you've got to make it as positive and as good for the duration of this instance. So I think this, ego strengthening is the way to go. And I think with the definitions that you've put out there, it's not a bad thing. It's a
ego strengthening really has to do with, it's like a willingness to be what you are.
Yes.
It's no need to be bigger than you are or smaller than you are. To be arrogant is to be bigger than you are. To be unconfident and woe is me and lacking self-worth is to be smaller than you are. Both of those is a contortion of ego. To just be what you are. And
to be something that is not, just to sort of map yourself onto something that is completely not you, because I can only be what I am with all my flaws and fuck-ups and
that's a limited thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what, like, the work of ego strengthening is to find what your limits are. And that's limited by emotion, that's limited by means, that's limited by trauma, that's limited by story, it's limited by desire and affect, and it's like to figure out what you are not a god and not a demon, and work then in the sphere of limitation and really excel at being the limited thing that you are, is to just be what you are.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to psychedelics, something that I see a lot is people will have these mystical archetypal experiences and they're afraid to make it personal. I've met the big blue whale that swims through all of the heavens, and it's this beatific vision, and it's stunning, and clearly this person is affected by that vision, but there's no connection between the ego, the person, and that experience. There's no through line, so it just remains this kind of imaginal thing that has no actual effect or bearing on your life. Versus if you enter into a conversation with that, if you try and digest some bites of that food and turn it into your life, maybe you become a bit more motherly, or you become a bit more flexible in your like swimming through the depths, or like you paint your walls blue. I don't fucking know. like there's a way that you can kind of work with this stuff in the here and now in your limited sphere, and that's the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't take anything away from what comes next. You know, it's not. I don't think it's exclusive. So I think you can, you know, whether you agree with my sort of spiel or not, that you can do both. You can bring some of that back and make your meat existence more meaningful, and still the transcendent timelines of infinity are still there happening anyway. So you know, you're not sort of taking anything away from anything.
Right. Yeah, to be limited does not mean that there's not potential for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
To be limited only means that this moment is limited, so I need to be discerning and choose wisely with how I engage in this moment, because it's a limited moment. But I still have access via the unconscious, which we expose with psychedelics, to the infinite potential and realm of possibility. Again, just shining the flashlight. Like, I want to channel that infinite possibility into this thing for this moment, because that's what's meaningful.
I think that line there is an awesome way to end. What I'm going to do, Mackenzie, I mean, we're going to carry on talking, talking shit all night. So I'm going to put some links in the description below to Mackenzie's Instagram. Let's say go and check it out. I think she does these really great sort of like video, like very short, very digestible video essays about all this kind of like awesome stuff we're talking about. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Guys, thanks for watching. And yeah. Cheers.
Cheers.
Dude. Bing.